What was your worst sleepover experience during your childhood? I was invited to a birthday party in elementary. Everybody kept talking about the slumber party afterwards. I assumed I was also invited to the slumber party, so I brought my sleeping bag and pajamas. Turns out, nobody actually wanted me there. I cried in the host's room alone for an hour or so, then faked being sick and had my grandma come pick me up. In a carpool from soccer practice with a teammate's classmate with whom I shared a lot of mutual friends. Her mom casually mentioned her upcoming birthday party. The girl angrily shouted at her mom, and in front of other girls in the car, "Thanks for bringing it up, mom. Now I have to invite me. I'm young." So when I got the invite, my mom makes me go. I don't remember too much about the party, except for when someone decided all us girls were going to relocate our sleeping bags from the basement to the upstairs living room to watch a movie. The birthday girl went down to grab everyone's sleeping bags. When she brought them all up and everyone was snuggled in, mine wasn't there. I went downstairs into the basement, and she had purposely left only mine down there, Girls sleepover when I was in elementary for a friend's birthday. Had a great time laughing and telling scary stories before bed. Woke up the next morning with a fever and terrible nausea. Went home and I was only getting worse. I had a huge spot on my leg in between my ankle and knee, right in the middle. It was hot, puffy, and red. Went to the hospital and it turns out I was suffering from a really bad staph infection. The night before, we were playing on the stairs when I slipped and scraped my leg. The doctor initially thought I was bitten by a spider. The infection was spreading fast and was eating away at my flesh. I had a tunnel up to my kneecap that had to be packed with fresh gauze every day. Almost lost my leg. Friends decided to set up a mock game of Survivor, based on the reality show, which turned out to be an excuse to vote out the friend nobody likes first. Guess who was the friend nobody liked? Had my first ever sleepover with my best friend in the first grade. Things at night were awesome. When I woke up the next morning everyone at his house was super distant, and they called my mom to get rid of my ASAP. His father had an aneurysm that night and passed away. After everything settled he and his mom moved away and I never saw them again. My friend had a poster of the live action Cat in the Hat in her room and the thing scared me so bad at night that I couldn't fall asleep and I just sat there on the floor the whole night. My parents sent me to spend the night with my friend. When I got home the next day my mom told me my dad moved out and they were getting a divorce. I didn't see my dad for 3 years. Went to a friend's birthday party in 4th grade. About halfway through the night we decided to play hide and seek. Maybe 30-45 minutes later, all I know is it was a long ass time. I come out of my hiding place to find them playing on the Wii in the living room. They'd forgotten about me and thought everyone was found so they moved on to the next thing without me. Went to a girl's sleepover where there were 3 of us. The girl's dad put an audio recorder under the teddies on top of her cupboard when he came in to hand them out. Would have been about 8 years old. We were talking about crushes at school and such. Next day he played the recording out loud to wake us up, laughing and listening closely to what we were talking about. In front of us. They moved away eventually. 14 years later the girl messages me and asks if I remember anything weird happening at that sleepover. I told her what I remembered and it turned out she was being sexually abused by him. We were 13 I would guess. Normally I would always stay at my friend's place but this time we stayed at mine. My parents took us to the bar which was something people did at the time. Well my father decided to get blackout drunk and us 2 13-year-olds were stuck in a bar from 8 PM until 1 AM. It was getting pretty uncomfortable between the parents and even some of the other people in the bar. Cause well kinda shitty to have a couple of 13-year-olds in a bar on a Friday night at 1 AM. So when my father got up to use the bathroom my mom grabbed us and we ran out to the van. He came out screaming through a beer and was banging on the van screaming all sorts of obscenities. While we get home, get some dinner finally and my mom goes to bed. My friend and I decide to watch Who Framed Roger Rabbit in the living room which I never got to use. But hey dad is gone. Well an hour later he shows up. And he just sits on the couch and smokes pot until falling asleep an hour later. So we sneak off to my room and my friend's parents picked us up to stay at his place. And that was the last time I ever had a friend over. I'm pretty pale. I sat up during a sleepover with a bunch of girls and made one of them scream because she saw me in a mirror and thought I was a ghost. Not me but my sister. She was a sleepwalker. She was about 7. Slept over at a friend's house. Sleepwalked. Woke up in an enclosed space. Panicked. Pushed her arms straight out in front of her against what she thought was a wall in front of her. She had ended up behind a 7-foot tall bureau that was placed diagonally in the corner of the dining room. She pushed it over. It was full of plates, glasses, fine china, etc. It was 4 AM. When I slept at a friend's, I went for it and blocked the toilet. His poor dad had to put on some rubber gloves and break up my monster turd. I felt so ashamed about it. Edit. So many replies. Sorry I couldn't reply to you, I was sleeping. Friend's mother and her boyfriend were arguing in the kitchen after we went to bed. He started talking about how he would kill the kids if I have to. I was about 7 or 8 I guess. So it didn't really sink in that much at the time, but my friend wasn't really in a great mood for the rest of the time I was there. Went to my friend's house for the first time. She always wanted to come to my house, not the other way around, but never told me why. So I get there and after the first hour it all goes downhill. The parents had strict rules about eating at the table. Proceed to insult me about my weight. I have always been skinny but not unhealthy, so to the point I nearly cried. After that they do 21 questions about my race and family. By the time night comes I found out they basically have a lockdown rule in their house. We weren't allowed out of her bedroom until morning and I didn't know that. So I got lectured the next morning. And the end finale was I didn't know I'd be forced to attend their church in the morning before I could go home. So that's how I figured out why she always wanted to stay at my house, not the other way around. Bonus. At one point I overheard her parents talking about me when on the phone with her. They called me a few nasty names and slurs for always inviting her to hang out and go places with my family and putting ideas into her head apparently. I will never forget these people. When I was around 10 I went to a sleepover for my mother's friend's daughter. I didn't know anyone else there, was pretty shy, but in general down for junk food and silly movies. In the middle of the night one of the other kids started freaking out and having an anxiety attack, screaming about how everyone hated her and throwing stuff everywhere. I stood up and immediately got hit directly in the nose by a heavy dinner plate chucked like a frisbee, fell backwards, hit my head on the window frame, lucky escape, and passed out. I underplayed how bad it had been to my parents because I didn't want them to freak out. So it was a week or so before my mum was concerned enough that my nose still hurt to take me to the GP. He was a quack, and without really looking just said that since I didn't have panda eye bruising it was fine and I was being over dramatic. A month later I fessed up to how bad it had actually been, and that it still hurt. My mum took me to a second doctor, who within 5 minutes had referred me to get x-rays and see the plastic steam. They found that my bridge had shattered into pieces and cracked vertically down the middle. The impact had spread pieces into places they shouldn't be, and because of the delay had started healing like that. Their advice was to leave it until I was fully grown, and then fix it if there were issues. And that's the story of how a sleepover experience means that I can't breathe properly, snore like a middle-aged man, have to be careful what glasses I buy, and I'm 20 years later considering getting my nose broken cause I can't deal with this it anymore. I still have a vertical crack down the bridge of my nose and loose shards of bone in there that I can scrape against each other to make my nose click as a party trick. Think it was around grade 3 or 4. I had a best friend with a big house and 2 parents who later divorced a couple years after. I'll say his dad was a huge garage dad. As in the guy had his own brand new fishing boat he cleaned every day in there. All his trophies, life relics, everything was in there. The floor of the garage was nicely carpeted, and legit everything in there was spotless. Anytime I went over, his dad spent most of his waking hours in that garage. My friend, his brother and I somehow got into a water battle with the garden hose super suckers. I can't really remember how or why it started, but as you can guess, we moved our battle into the garage and left the garden hose running inside. We must have left it running from lunchtime, and his dad didn't come home until 5 or 6. I'll never forget the absolute hysterical screams and wails my friend and his brother made to their mom, who was closing her eyes crying. begging for her to do something while their dad was dragging them into that garage. The screams and yelling from the dad inside the garage continued for the entire hour it took for my parents to pick me up. They were beaten so bad, I don't think my friend could sit down for a solid week. One time when I was a kid I was visiting a friend's family. I'll call this friend Rob. One day Rob and I were in the living room watching TV and snacking and Rob accidentally drops a chip on the floor. It didn't make any mess whatsoever and he picked it up. Rob's mom saw this immediately and aggressively picked him up by the collar and dragged him into a room a few feet away, shut the door, and immediately begins beating the life out of Rob over a chip. It was horrible. I do not think I have ever heard anyone screaming and crying in so much fear and pain in my entire life. I had absolutely no idea what to do. I just sat on the couch listening to the entire thing with my jaw dropped. After a while she came out like everything was normal with Rob, who had a teary face. I had to continue the rest of my visit pretending like I wasn't super freaked out by that entire thing. I am no longer in contact with Rob and unfortunately I don't have any way of contacting him. But I imagine that was not the first or the final time that has happened to him and I often wonder if he is okay now. That entire incident felt like a script, like a routine. The swiftness, her blank expression the entire time. This was their normal. This is one of my core memories even though it happened in practically a blink of an eye. Sigh. So I was 11 and a quiet kid. I'd not yet come into my own. So my social skills were a bit weak and I was overly shy with people I didn't know. This led to me only really making 1 or 2 close friends during my first year at comprehensive high school. One of these friends happened to have the same name as me, so we bonded pretty quickly due to teachers mixing us up a lot etc. Anyway, we were becoming good friends. He invited me for a sleepover a few months later, and I agreed. I went over his place and we wandered around his town, got some snacks, bumped into a couple of other kids from our class. It was cool. Back at his place in the night, he declared that we were gonna play a game of truth or dare. I mean, I'm 11 and a pretty innocent, sheltered kid, so to me, that was as innocent as playing tag. So I agreed. The rules were simple. Here are 6 pieces of paper each. Write 3 dares and 3 truth questions. Scrunch them up and chuck them in a jar. We'd then take turns to pull them out and answer to them. Sounds fun. Let's go. I pull out the first piece. It's one of my own. And it reads, who do you fancy in our year? Mild. Look, I was an innocent kid, so this was the pinnacle of my gossip imagination. I told him. And that was that. His turn. He pulls out a piece, rolls his eyes, and says nonchalantly, I knew I'd get this one. He drops the paper down so I can read it. It's one of his own. It reads, shove pen up her ass. Time stood still for that moment. I didn't have a ducking clue how to process it. Of all the possibilities, he chose shoving a pen up one's asshole as one of 3 dares. At the age of 11, I was still processing the paper with a little frown and a tilt of my innocent head, when I was about to have some brand new ducking information to process. Before I could react, he stood up, grabbed the pen we'd used to write the dares, bent forward and just stuffed it on back there. He pulled a little face as he did it, but it just went straight in. We held some pretty awkward eye contact, him in a state of complete comfort, me in a state of borderline breakdown, before he casually pulled it back out with a subtle pop. He looked at the pen, and it was missing the lid. I was ducking mortified at seeing this, but he just rolled his eyes again, slipped the pen back up there and rummaged around until it made a click. Then he pulled it back out complete with its lid, and a nice big clump of it firmly lodged on top of it. He then opened his attic window, and with a blank expression, flung the pen off into the woods like he'd done this a million times before. He then sat down and said, right, your turn. Fast forward to some years later. Turns out he was gay and wanted to initiate something with me, to which I didn't reciprocate nor acknowledge at the time. So yeah, dem sleepovers. It was my birthday party. I was around 10. I invited all my friends, about 4 of them. A couple hours into the sleepover, I found out the hard way that none of them liked me, and they had just came to my party to hang out with each other when they kept excluding me from everything, and they finally told me. I spent the whole night crying in my room, but at least they all had to sleep in the floor without blankets or pillows because they didn't know where to find them. using a throwaway for this because it's so ducking embarrassing. I grew up with a girl a couple of doors down who I considered one of my best friends. When we were maybe 10 or 11 she had a birthday party sleepover, and I was invited along with 6 other girls. We played games, did our hair, watched movies, and sang karaoke. Toward the end of the night she told me, in front of all the other girls, that I couldn't sleep over because she could only have 6 friends there, something she hadn't mentioned until that point. I was crushed, but I packed up my sleeping bag and all the stuff I'd brought and prepared to walk home. On my way out I passed another girl who was arriving late to the party with all her sleepover gear in hand. I walked home in the dark and didn't tell my mother what had happened. I played Monopoly by myself and pretended everyone else was there with me. My friend never apologized and I never said anything about it. Edit. To answer the question that has been asked a couple of times. No, I did not stop being her friend. And she didn't improve much from there. Growing up I didn't always make the best choices when it came to friendships. I am better about it now. I do appreciate the sympathy, though. I actually expected to be made fun of when I started writing this. Hence the throwaway. Also shout out to therapists who hear this kind of stuff day after day and then help with all the hard work that comes after. I was about 7. I went to a friend's place just as his dad got home after accidentally shooting and killing his friend. I was too scared to leave and it was a big place and I guess we kind of just kept out of the way. His screams of anguish kept me up all night. Was a dark night. Having a Mortal Kombat 2 tournament with my friends on Sega Genesis. I was on a winning streak but suddenly I felt a rumbling in my stomach. Now Mortal Kombat 2 did not have any sort of pause feature. I knew I could hold it for just a few moments longer. Just had to KO my friend and I'd win. Right down to the wire. When he had about 1 hit of health left, it happened. I hit my pants. Fatality. Edit. First time ever getting awards and it's from a story about hitting myself. Thanks, I guess. It was like 6 or 7 of us at a friend's house. Hot summer night so we're camping outside in sleeping bags. It's pretty late early and we've been ducking with each other all night, tossing little pebbles, running around, dragging each other around in sleeping bags, the usual. Well, I feel a nudge when drowsy and just wave it off. Then I feel a nudge inside of my sleeping bag and immediately hear a squeaky screech. I scream and everyone immediately pops up. I'm zipped up in a mummy style sleeping bag so when I stand it's still wrapped and so is the screeching in my bag. Quick-witted kid named Cade runs over and shakes my ass out of the bag and a huge ducking bat flies out. I later harness this fear and become Batman. Edit. It did not bite me. Cade's mom did a very awkward full body search at her. She was coincidentally an RN, which is why that kid had quick wit. This was in 2009 or 2010 maybe, so I was only 9 years old. This new kid moved onto the street and we became pretty good friends. We found ourselves playing video games way late at night, but I would always go home since I only lived a few houses down. One night he asked me to spend the night, so we built a fort in his upstairs game room using the couch cushions and blankets. Everything was fine until around 1 AM. Everyone in his house was sound asleep but me. I was laying there in my makeshift fort when I heard the sound of heels on tile walking down the hallway adjacent to where we set up the forts. I mean, it was distinct and loud. To this day I could not imagine it being something else. The weird thing about it was their house floor was carpet, so I couldn't pinpoint exactly where it was coming from. I also didn't have a phone at this time, so I was peering into the darkness through a crack in my fort when the walking sound stopped. After a moment of silence it sounded as if it was sprinting in my direction. So I quickly hid behind the cushions when something knocked over the whole fort. This woke my friend up and he blamed me for doing it. To this day I have never done back to his house to spend the night. Someone tried to glue my eyes shut. Well, one sleepover one of my friends figured out jacking off and had zero shame. Definitely jacked off in front of like 5 of us. In high school I went to stay over with my buddy at one of his friend's houses and it turned out that it wasn't really his friend, it was some dude from Xbox Live that lived in the same town but was for sure older. Had to have been in his 20s when we were 16. Smoked some kind of seed mix that he claimed had some kind of hallucinogenic property. I believe he called it Yopo. Anyways, honestly not my worst night, but my mom would have ducking died if she knew what I was up to, lol. I've already commented, but duck it. When I was like 14, I was at a big group sleepover with my friends. The mother of the girl who was hosting it was really strict about health, and she told us that we couldn't order any pizza until we'd eaten the massive fruit platter she'd prepared for us. No one was touching the platter other than taking a few pieces to snack on. It was getting late. The pizza place would be closing soon and her mum was not budging about her rule. Someone needed to step up. That someone was me. I started absolutely devouring the fruit platter, shoving pieces into my mouth and swallowing them without chewing. This was a platter for like 8 people. But I was a woman on a mission. We did end up getting pizza, but I got so sick I spent most of the night throwing up in the toilet. I couldn't even enjoy the pizza cause I was so full. I slept over my friend's house when I was like 7 and her dog had to go to the bathroom in the middle of the night and was whining at the door. Her mom woke up and went out and hit the dog with a pan. It was terrible and I never slept over her house again because of that. I ate an entire box of fruit roll-ups and puked rainbows for an hour. I was meant to stay the night with a kid just a few doors down from my grandparents. He lived with his grandparents and his grandpa was a facilities manager at an upscale apartment complex. Might have even been a country club, and offered to take us swimming for the day. His grandfather drops us off at the main pool and says he'll be back in a while. This pool was Olympic sized and simply had too many people. So we decided to explore and ended up at a smaller pool on the property elsewhere. We were swimming, having a good time and everything was great. That is, until he started a splash fight. We were going back and forth until he started screaming at me, top of his lungs, screaming at me, incoherent screams. He kept coming toward me and I was kind of laughing, kind of scared and had no idea what was going on. He ends up cornering me and tries to push me under the water. Still screaming, I wrestle myself free and hit him square in the nose. His nose starts bleeding like Niagara Falls and he started screaming Methodica repeatedly as loud as his lungs could muster. I got out of the pool and grabbed my things and started back for the front of the complex. The entire time this kid screaming the same word over and over. People are staring. People are trying to calm him down. He's walking after me like the goddamn Terminator. Hands at his sides in fists. This 4'0" kid, covered in blood from his nose, just slowly walking after me, ignoring the entire world around him while screaming Methodica. I make it back to the front of the place and am desperately trying to get someone to let me use a phone to call home. No one will listen. They're enamored with the screaming kid who, by the way, is still lumbering after me. He's a bloody mess. Nose running like a fountain, mixing with the water from when he got out of the pool. Looks like a walking murder scene. Out of nowhere, his grandfather appears and snatches him up and disappears with him through a door. What feels like forever passes and I'm still trying to get someone to let me use a phone when his grandfather reappears and asks what happened, then tells me he has to take kid home and I can't go with him. They let me use the phone. My parents don't answer. I ended up getting a hold of my aunt who was still working and couldn't come get me for another 2 hours. The office wouldn't let me stay inside, so I was outside in the parking lot standing around waiting for her to show. Still having no idea WTF happened. Aunt shows up and off we go. Get home. Get my ass chewed for being 35 minutes away from home. I had no idea how long the car ride was at the time. A few days later my mom went to talk to kid's grandfather. She comes back to tell me we can't hang out anymore and she tells me he needs medication for keep him calm and they missed his dose that day and it wasn't my fault. Never saw him again. Oh boy, I got one. Really ducked up. And my ex-friend ruined our friendship of like 4-5 years. Started hanging when we were like 5. This happened when I was either 9 or 10, in one single night. For absolutely no ducking reason other than him being a creep jackass. So for the most part, the sleepover was typical, movie, video games, popcorn, pretty standard stuff. Then it comes time to go to bed. I go into the bathroom and change into my pajama pants. Then walk back in and he's already in his bed and smirking. Didn't really think much of it. So I crawled into my sleeping bag. Well, his sleeping bag. But he let me use it and asked if he wanted to play some video games more. This is where it gets weird. He throws open the blanket and he's naked. Kid basically just flashed me. The duck? Understandably stunned, I say something along the lines of "the hell is wrong with you?" put some clothes on. And he goes, nope, my house, my rules. So I'm really uncomfortable now. Really don't want to sleep. But he covers himself back up with his blankets and says he'll put his clothes back on. Which he does. So really pissed at him. But at this time he was my best friend. And longest friend I've had in my life. So I try to shrug it off. And we play some more video games for a little bit. Then turn off the lights and go to sleep. Then it gets worse. Not too long after the lights go out I hear him rustling around. Then getting out of his bed. He says I'm naked again. Laughs. Then tries to lay on me. Duck that. I shove him off. And he keeps trying to lay on me. Basically a brief back and forth goes on. And at this point I'm pretty much yelling at him to leave me alone and go to sleep. I hear him stand up. Okay, good. He's going to leave me alone now, right? I start to feel something splattering against my sleeping bag where my feet were. Didn't take long for me to figure it out. Dude was pissing on me. Told him I was going home as I'm trying to get out of the sleeping bag. But before I can get all of the way out he body slams me. I was a pretty strong kid so it didn't hurt that bad. I was more stunned. But boy, after all of that I just didn't care anymore. I was seeing red. He stood up to body slam me again. Just as I got my legs out from the sleeping bag. As he goes to jump on me I kick him in the stomach as hard as I can. And he goes down gasping, crying. I woke up his mom. It was like 11:30 PM to 12 AM at this point, and told her what happened. She goes into the room to find her naked son on the floor crying. Basically yells at me to leave. Didn't have to tell me twice. So I call my mom and wait for her on their front porch as my friend's mom is basically opening up a can of whoopers once she sees the pee on the sleeping bag ground. I probably should have left right away, but as I said before, he was my longest best friend I had back at the time. We had sleepovers before and he had never done anything like that. I think I was mostly just stunned of what he was doing. Which is why it took me so long to leave. Never talked to him since. So yay, that's my story. Thanks for reading. I bled through my underwear and pajamas all over my friend's bed. I was mortified and too embarrassed to tell her. I cleaned up in the bathroom before anyone else was up. I then made the bed up before anyone could see it. I still feel so terrible and embarrassed about it almost 15 years later.